Alright, welcome back to another episode of Bear's Guide to a 5. Today we are talking about geographic technologies and we have to assess their usefulness. Are they useful? Yes, very much so. We don't have to think about that. What we do have to think about, though, is that at this point, we have an idea of, projections and maps and scale, and we're wondering to ourselves, like, why do we need to know this? Let me reiterate, or at least bring up this point for the first time for some of you. You're going to be asked questions in AP Human Geography where you will have to read maps, you'll have to look at data, you'll have to look at scale, and you'll not only have to answer the question based on the data presented, but you also have to question that data and why it could be wrong or be skeptical about the data. So this is just what we're covering today is going over more tools that are used by geographers that can be used in examples for you to answer questions about. That's it. So that's why we're learning this stuff. All right, where do we get geographical data? Well, obviously the first is field work. This is literally geographers going out into the field and researching, taking pictures, gathering data, talking to people, whatever it may be. The next way, and this one's a little more important for your knowledge, satellite imagery. And three technologies we're going to talk about today are GPS, remote sensing, and GIS. The final source of geographic data that geographers use is the census. And we're going to talk about the census briefly and how we need to use it. It'll come up again throughout the course, but for right now I'm going to try and keep it as basic as possible. So what's GPS? GPS is known as the Global Positioning System. This is really simple. You guys have been very fortunate to have this your whole lives in your pocket with smartphones. So you're pretty acquainted with the technology. Basically, there are satellites floating in space, and GPS uses or pinpoints your location using some of those satellites floating in space, and it gives the precise location of something on Earth. That is the whole point of GPS, is to find out exactly where something is on the planet. Our next geographical technology that we use in satellite form is remote sensing. Now, this one's a little more important because satellites in space are scanning the Earth's surface for images. That's it. They're just taking pictures of the Earth's surface. So while GPS is pinpointing your location, remote sensing is taking pictures. Two unique things, two different, and you must know the differences between those two. So what can we do with that data? What could we do with GPS satellites pinpointing exact locations and remote sensing that's taking all these pictures of the Earth? Well, we use GIS, or the Geographic Information System, where it takes these images and layers them on top of a map, layers this data, so then we can analyze it and look at it. And trust me, we'll see plenty of examples of this throughout the course. So as I mentioned, GPS and remote sensing, they both use satellites, but GPS uses it to pinpoint an exact location on the planet, and remote sensing uses it to take pictures. And as I said, once we get that data, we want to map it. So let's see what it looks like. This is us using GIS and remote sensing to look at the Detroit area of the United States of Michigan. So obviously we have our map projection, right? We have our thematic map in front of us. And our thematic map, we just have symbols. It looks like we have dots that we're also using, and we're using a little bit of choropleth. So we have some different parts of different types of thematic maps. So here we need to think of, well, why would we use this? Why would this be crucial to us? Well, if we look at people who are living in poverty, which are those red dots, and then we want to compare them on how close they are to supermarkets, which is that choropleth part where it's that different shades of green, all of a sudden you begin to notice that those red dots, people who live in poverty, aren't near supermarkets. But what are they near? Well, we use remote sensing to capture images of McDonald's, and we layer that on top of people in poverty near supermarkets, and then all of a sudden we start to see a trend that there's more McDonald's in low-income neighborhoods and low access to supermarkets, and not as many supermarkets in places where people have access to food. Does anyone else see something here? Am I the only one that? Yeah, this is exactly. You should be thinking right now that, wait, that doesn't look right, and this is what GIS and remote sensing can do for us. We can analyze things like this and then start to solve issues within our community, right? This is one of the powers of these geographic technologies. Another example of geographic technologies, we can look at agricultural demands of the planet. We can see resources throughout the planet, and we can zoom in and increase that scale and get really definitive answers to try and help people around the world. Remote sensing also is used every day. I mentioned that whole Google Images so many times throughout my lessons because I don't know about you, but sometimes I end up on Google Maps, clicking all the way through and then zooming all the way in people's yards and looking at their houses and moving through streets and then going to my house and going, oh, it's my house. That's the same thing. We're using remote sensing technology, and we can zoom in so much. We can increase that resolution. We can increase that scale that we can see so much data. Now, I know that geographers would never use Google Maps in resolution and scale to zoom in, and we won't use that either. But to give you an idea of the power of the technology. All right, for our last one, we're looking at census data. Now, the reason why geographers use census data is because simply we have to know where people are. And it's really easy to chart on a map, a thematic map, where people are, certain data of people when they literally just fill out the form. Now, there are other government reasons that people fill out the census, and there are other reasons in politics why you should fill it out based on representation and people in the House of Representatives, but we'll get to that later. Essentially, what the census does is it collects this thing called demographic data. Demographics is a word you're going to hear me use a lot in this class, and you're going to use it a lot for the rest of your life. Demographics is just data about people. It's the stuff you see in front of you: family size, home vacancy, what's the ethnicity, what is the sex, what is the age, what is your income rate, all that stuff. These are just demographics, data about people that we like to collect so we can make inferences and stuff like that. And then we can take census data, as I just said, literally collecting it, and we can just throw it on a map, and we can see this. This map is irrelevant. You don't have to know the content on any of these maps, but I just try to use it as an example, that we take the census data on level of education, and then we plot it where the yellow is lower education and the dark green is the highest education. And now we can look at this and we can start going, oh, we can make inferences about education levels in the United States and maybe see how people use their money, how they vote, so on and so forth. I don't know. It can be anything. And as always, looking at different types, because remember, you can't just throw the data on a map. This in front of us is a thematic map. It is a choropleth map. You can see it by the shades, so on and so forth. We can use a census map to look at the impacts of racism. Yeah, we're going to be talking about it a lot in this class, and I hate to throw it at you in a random video, but we can see where people have historic injustices from housing discrimination and how we still see it today, where we have percentage of white population and people of color, and how drastic that difference happens over just a street, where we can see it in development over years and years. But we'll talk more about this later. So what do you need to know? Essentially this is that geographers collect data through fieldwork, satellite technology, and the census. And they use that to show data on different types of thematic maps so we can start to solve some problems in the world. You also need to be able to explain how these technologies work independently and how they work together. So be able to explain how GPS works, how GIS works, and how remote sensing works. But then be able to explain how those three things work together. And seriously, don't get them confused. GPS, location. Remote sensing, pictures. GIS puts it all together. And then finally, understand why the census is important. Really understanding those demographics. And like I said, we will come back to it later. So as always, if you have any questions, please leave them in the comments or come talk to me. Make sure you hit that like button and smash that subscribe button so you know when new videos are released so you're not confused. This was Bear's Guide to a 5, and I look forward to seeing you again.